Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the building of cyber resilience in non-profit and small and medium-sized enterprises. I want to start with my forecast of the cyber threat and then suggest some sensible, affordable responses that we should take now. I want to conclude by discussing how best we can anticipate, that's a key word for me, anticipate what a serious cyber attack would actually mean for our organizations, and thus understand the priorities for building cyber resilience. I'm going to have to be brief, but practical suggestions can be found in my recent Penguin paperback, How to Survive a Crisis, and I also recommend working through the excellent set of cyber essentials explained on the website of the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Centre. Improving cybersecurity is visibly a major policy preoccupation today for governments and large commercial organisations, but the threat affects us all, not just the big national players. I think we have to accept that in the years to come, we're going to suffer more cyber attacks on small and medium-sized enterprises, including hospitals, clinics, universities, schools, charities, and other non-profit organisations. The continued survival of many smaller organisations is going to depend upon whether those who are in charge today anticipated the cyber risks and took sensible precautionary measures. So, it's not a question of whether attacks will come, but when and how, and when it happens, whether lack of prior preparation will create a crisis of survival for the organisation. Now, the reasons for the increase in the threat, which I am predicting, are obvious enough. We could start with the nature of the criminal mind. Cybercrime is currently costing over 9 trillion euros a year. Criminals will always prefer the easiest, most vulnerable targets. They know that big national organisations are now better protected. That's the hunting ground of the Advanced Persistent Threat Groups, or APTs, such as we find in the Chinese, Russian, North Korean and Iranian secret agencies, and they often use criminal hackers for their legwork, seeking, for example, zero-day exploits that will enable them to penetrate even well-protected adversary networks. We see attacks for espionage, such as the recent Chinese state Salt Typhoon attacks on telecoms companies that enabled them to listen to conversations between senior officials. Some attacks, such as in the Chinese Volt Typhoon campaign, were sabotage attacks that penetrated into the critical infrastructure of the United States to plant malware, to be activated in some international crisis to distract government and upset everyday life just when people needed to focus. But what we have to recognise here, and why I mention these attacks, is that small and medium-sized companies that would not see themselves as critical service providers will nevertheless just get caught up as collateral damage in such attacks. We suffered this in the United Kingdom, with the WannaCry attacks on the National Health Service, for example. The Russian NotPetya malware attack that they launched on Ukrainian infrastructure spread outside Ukraine and did almost 9 billion euros worth of damage to businesses, small as well as large. Hackers have also adopted the tactic of directing their attack on big targets through smaller, weaker companies in the supply chain. Those companies may have connectivity with their clients, or they may hold valuable data. This is what you find with accountancy or law firms. An example was the 2023 hack of a medium-sized UK payroll provider in order to get to its major clients, including British Airways and Boots Pharmaceuticals. The payroll company used a popular file transfer program, MoveIt, and that proved to be the weak link in the chain allowing the Russian cyber attackers to get in to steal the data of their main targets. I'm sure, very sure, that small HR human resources company did not think of themselves as being a natural target for a Russian cyber attacker. For most criminal groups, the prevailing cyber business model is simple enough. Shake down the most vulnerable organizations you can find, regardless of where they are or what line of business they're in, and do so using, preferably, simple methods that rely on very human weaknesses, such as spear phishing to get employees to click on dodgy links, or to respond to fraudulent instructions from the boss to pay non-existent suppliers. It may have been because of laziness in installing available patches quickly enough, or it may have been a misguided sense of economy that led to old software being used, no longer maintained by the manufacturer, but all in the mistaken assumption it will save on cost, only to discover, after an attack, the huge costs associated with fixing a successful attack. I mentioned the 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack on our health service. It cost the British National Health Service €85 million in IT costs alone for the recovery. Another driver of rising threat is the democratization of malware. Criminal groups don't have to be expert hackers anymore. They have access to, or they can simply hire as a service, the malware they need to extort victims. That includes automated scanning software that can detect unpatched or out-of-date systems that are vulnerable to well-known attacks. Over the last few years, many organizations have woken up to find they're locked out of their data and their terminals. And often, to add to that pain is the added extortion threat that stolen data will be published. So, for an organization like a health clinic, that means suddenly no diagnostic MRI or X-ray machines, no patient data, no test results, and the real threat of reputational damage from disclosure of patient data. And for organizations that are affected by ransomware, even if you pay the ransom in Bitcoin, which I certainly do not advise you should, there's no guarantee you get your data back. You're as likely to end up on a list of sucker organizations that circulates on the dark web, inviting other criminals to have a go at you since you paid up. When the rewards for a particular type of exploitation decline due to better security or technological change, the criminals simply shift their efforts to other targets of opportunity. And for the future, we have to expect that they will use the ability of generative AI, artificial intelligence, to improve the computer code they use to make sure their malware is harder to detect. And we've already seen some examples of this so-called living off the land feature of recent attacks, where it's your legitimate software used on your network that the attackers repurpose to commit their crimes. So, in short, the only sensible assumption to make is that regardless of the type of organization, we're all likely at some point to be a target or to be caught up as collateral damage or simply end up one of the many victims of some IT accident. You may recall the 2024 CrowdStrike upgrade that inadvertently ended up bricking hundreds of thousands of computers that were running Microsoft Windows. That was just an accident. There are, to move on to remedies, there are inexpensive, basic cyber hygiene measures that everyone should adopt, and I'm sure many of those listening will have already done that. But it's worth checking. The website of the UK National Cyber Security Centre, the NCSC, which is an important part of my old organisation, the United Kingdom's Digital Intelligence Agency, GCHQ. The NCSC has on its website sound advice on what they call cyber essentials, including for small and medium-sized enterprises. For example, use professional antivirus software. Make sure it's regularly updated by the supplier. That reduces the risk that the criminals see you as easy meat. But you can't rely on such barriers. Instead, adopt a zero trust policy. Educate staff to be vigilant. Insist on using two-factor authentication when employees log in or clients and customers access data. Mandate the use of password managers. Control who has privileged access to network configuration and to the payment details of suppliers, and be especially careful to have sound security policies when employees bring their own devices to work. And, of course, promptly terminate the accounts of staff who leave for whatever the organisation, for whatever reason. I mentioned anticipation. I've always found this a useful word. Anticipation requires an act of imagination to actually feel what it would be like if a particular crisis beset the organisation, and to sense how well individuals in that organisation that you all know well, how well the systems would cope in those circumstances. The best way to do this is through a contingency planning exercise. So bring together all those who would have a part to play, advising on the situation from inside and outside the organisation, so that they can all get just a flavour of what it would really be like in a crisis. It's highly likely, in my experience, that such an exercise would reveal there are important practical steps that ought to be taken to close gaps in cyber resilience, and you can do that against a whole range of possible disruptions. Remembering, of course, that even unlikely events do sometimes happen. And I think if you're a member of a governance group or a board or an executive committee overseeing a small or medium-sized enterprise, you have to recognize that even small organizations are facing increasingly complex cyber risk landscapes. And as a governance group, you need to spend longer together thinking about how the organization might be impacted and asking sensible questions of the executives of what they've done so far to mitigate those risks. In my experience, sitting on various boards, I've found it helpful to organize a specific discussion of cyber resilience in 3 parts. And the first part of the discussion is when you pose the question, just how vulnerable do you think our organization is to risks that arise outside our control? An internet outage, for example, in the whole town or district, a fire in the building next door that knocks out the electricity, or a supplier that gets hacked, or interruptions to the supply of components and so on. There's a published UK risk register on the web that lists 89 distinct acute risks that should prompt questioning of the potential exposure of any organisation. The key question is to ask, when exactly did we last update our plans for such an emergency? Explain what is the state of contingency planning for the provision of communications, for example, if things get cut off, and for bringing in the legal, technical, market and other professional advice that might be needed in a major cyber incident, including, of course, what are those arrangements that we'd make at weekends or out of hours? A well-tuned organisation is one where it's clear who will be responsible for what in an emergency, including who faces the media, particularly if it's the middle of the night. If you have such plans, contingency plans, even in outline, you can improvise around the planning, even in the face of very unexpected events. So you don't focus just on a few scenarios, but you make sure you have generic planning around which you can modify in the event of an incident. Managing the risk, though, it's not just about being prepared to bring in the cybersecurity experts to help recover lost data or to get compromised networks functioning again. A resilient organization will have practiced how, in an emergency, it communicates with its clients, with its customers, with its investors, suppliers, donors, and of course, with our own staff and the public at large. That's essential to maintain confidence in the organization and its mission, despite having a disruption which may be very public. We can all train our teams to avoid being caught off guard in critical moments. One of the characteristics of resilient organizations, which is well documented in the literature, is that they do tend to be better at managing reputational risk when a major problem arises. And if, for example, you're in the healthcare business, that really matters. Moving on, I suggest a second part of the agenda should be about the specific risks relevant to the kind of organization you're talking about. What are your crown jewels, as they're called, of data without which the organization cannot function, or that would be especially attractive to criminals, including personal financial information of staff and clients? When you've identified these crown jewels, you need to think about extra protection for them. For example, keeping them in a secure cloud with only nominated staff able to access the data. You need to look at the adequacy of the audit and reporting systems for financial and other data control. What assurances do you have that delegated limits on authority to make deals or incur liabilities are being used appropriate? Because those can be targets for the cyber attackers. Spotting an anomaly is often the first indication that hackers are inside the system, such as the true example of an auditor who spotted that an employee had 2 company mobile numbers listed on the network. They didn't. One belonged to the hackers. The third item on the agenda for the discussion at board level would be about self-imposed risks, as I call them. These are risks that the leadership of the organization took on itself, moving into a new line of business, merging with another organization, making staff redundant, and of course deciding to introduce new information technology systems. At the moment, for example, deciding you're going to use artificial intelligence. These are all examples of management initiatives that carry added risk. And so the questions to ask here are obviously, how do we know how much progress is being made with this initiative and by whom? Are problems always surfaced early enough to be dealt with? A too common example is a culture of keeping back disappointing news in the hope that local management can solve the problems themselves before senior levels get to know. Well, my time is up. I hope that these thoughts have given you some food for thought about steps that we can all take that reduce the risks from cyber attacks. Thank you for listening, and do enjoy the conference.